Welcome to Newsday on the BBC. I'm Sharonjit Lail in London. Our top story: at least 17 people are shot dead at a high school in Florida. A former student is arrested. It's over for South Africa's embattled President Jacob Zuma, who says he will resign.
I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore, also on the program. Morgan Tsvangirai, the veteran Zimbabwean opposition leader and prime minister, has died. He was suffering from cancer. And globally, more than 14 million girls marry each year as children. We speak to a child protection advocate who says this needs to stop.
Live from our studios in London and Singapore. This is BBC World News. It's Newsday.
Well, it's 1 a.m. in London, 9 in the morning in Singapore, and 8 p.m. in the evening in Florida, where a shooting at a high school has left 17 people dead and many injured. Police say they have arrested one man and identified him as a former student. Many students hid in classrooms until they were rescued by police. And Bill Hayton has more.
Running for their lives, students flee classrooms in panic. Inside the three-storey building, hundreds of others lay hiding from a gunman on the loose. As they streamed out of school, some were still clutching their Valentine's Day balloons.
As soon as the fire alarm got pulled and kids were evacuating, I heard 5 pops. And I was like, that's not a drill. I was like, and we never did a drill like that.
We hear about this all the time, but we never expect it to happen right here in your neighborhood. Everybody knows here is a safe place, and we don't expect this to happen here, but when that happens, we're just taken aback.
Dozens of police cars sped to the scene. Paramilitary units moved in to confront the shooter. They carried out a wounded student, improvising emergency transport, and a street corner became an emergency room. The more badly injured were stretchered away, and then a suspect, handcuffed by police on the roadside.
He was taken into custody, I believe, about an hour after he left Stoneman Douglas, after he committed this horrific, homicidal, detestable act.
He's been identified as a former student, Nicholas Cruz, apparently expelled for disciplinary reasons and with a social media profile showing an obsession with guns and violence. Bill Hayton, BBC News.
And for the latest on the investigation, I spoke a short time ago to the BBC's David Willis, who's in Washington.
The sheriff there in Broward County confirming that figure of 17 fatalities in this shooting incident, saying that 12 of those people died inside the school, 3 outside the school premises, and 2 in hospital or on their way to hospital, all of them from gunshot injuries. And it does appear that there's at least a dozen people who have also been taken to hospital, and some of those are thought to be suffering from quite severe gunshot injuries. One eyewitness was quoted earlier on as saying it was just blood all over the place. Clearly a very, very, very distressing afternoon for these young people.
Indeed, very distressing, as you say, David. We've also got a confirmation of the attacker's name, apparently a Nicholas Cruz sheriff, who is a former student. What more do we know about him?
Yes, we know that according to the Miami Herald, this is somebody who was a former student. The sheriff actually confirmed that he'd been expelled for disciplinary reasons, who officials at the school had been told to look out for. It was claimed in the previous weeks that he had some sort of motive to harm students, and so he was not to be allowed on the premises with any sort of backpack. Well, today he returned with very tragic consequences.
And it was David Willis speaking earlier to Sharon. A presidency that hung in the balance has finally fallen. South Africa's Jacob Zuma has resigned with immediate effect after mounting pressure from his party, the ANC, to go. He faced persistent allegations of corruption and will now be formally succeeded by Cyril Ramaphosa, the new leader of the ANC. Our Africa editor Fergal Keane has more.
The moment of decision came late, when the former guerrilla fighter at last recognized he could not win. President Jacob Zuma addressed the South African nation and faced reality. I was just yards from him when he said the decisive words.
The ANC should never be divided in my name. I have therefore come to the decision to resign as President of the Republic with immediate effect.
And with that statement, Jacob Zuma has brought to an end the most controversial period in the history of post-apartheid South Africa. History happening in a late-night statement, after a day in which it seemed he might still fight on. In Pretoria, seat of the presidency, rumours of an imminent resignation had rippled all afternoon. Yet when he made his first appearance of the day on state television, he was defiant and defensive. Zuma, the victim.
What have I done? Because I've explained many times that this process, there's nothing I've done wrong. This is policy. What people are suggesting is a new thing, the new phenomenon. What is the problem?
At the same time, in Cape Town, ANC MPs were meeting to decide whether they'd support a motion of no confidence to drive Jacob Zuma from power. The decision came quickly and was decisive.
We are now proceeding with, as the Chief Whip, to proceed with the motion of no confidence tomorrow, so that President Zuma is then removed, so that we can proceed to elect President Ramaphosa.
A populist, a crowd pleaser, he appealed to the ANC grassroots and with their backing became party leader in 2009. Even though he already faced serious corruption charges. I interviewed him just as he was about to become state president. A lot of people think you're a crook.
Is that so? I want to see those people. Like, I must tell me why they.
Are you a crook?
Me? Well, I don't know. Unless I must go to the dictionary and learn what a crook is.
It was his relationship with this family, the Guptas, Indian immigrants, which created the public outrage that finally forced the ANC to act. The Guptas are accused of using their connections with the president to acquire state enterprises and assets worth millions of pounds. So powerful, it's alleged, they could hire and fire cabinet ministers. Today, they too felt the pressure. This was a police raid on their compound in Johannesburg. Seemingly untouchable until now, criminal charges may be imminent. If ever you wanted proof of the changed political temperature, this is it. The police seem at last to have found their courage. By the end of this dramatic day, Jacob Zuma seemed friendless and politically isolated, resigning before he could be humiliated in Parliament. Fergal Keane, BBC News, Pretoria.
Kumi Naidoo is the chair at the solidarity group Africans Rising. It works for social inclusion and shared prosperity across the continent. He told me what these changes mean for the ANC's future.
It offers a possibility that the ANC can recover some of its lost appeal to the South African people. The decade of Jacob Zuma has been a decade of corruption, and there's a possibility now of a fresh start, but there are many challenges ahead. But I think the ANC itself, given that President Zuma chose in his words to urge his supporters not to engage in violence and so on, hopefully means that it will go smoothly, but we wait to see what happens in the next 48 hours.
And Cyril Ramaphosa will be facing these challenges. What kind of a leader is he, and what can he do for the country?
Cyril Ramaphosa played a major role in the negotiations process towards our constitution. He was the chair of the body that drafted the constitution. He's known as a seasoned negotiator, played a role in Northern Ireland and other parts of Africa in terms of, conflict resolution and so on. So he has, as a trade unionist, as a businessman, and as a politician, he does have a very good set of skills to actually manage the process of holding the ANC together as the party, but also recovering. We have state-owned enterprises that have been looted to a tremendous level by President Zuma's allies. We have our electricity body, Eskom, various other public state-owned enterprises are on the verge of bankruptcy. So we've been downgraded to junk status, by two investment firms and so on. So he has his work cut out for him, and the big question is, what happens to the charges against President Zuma and the allegations that he faces? And I think the people of South Africa want equality in the way the law is applied, and we expect that President Ramaphosa will not use politically influence inappropriately, but justice is done.
And that was Kumi Naidoo speaking earlier to Rico. Staying with Africa, Morgan Tsvangirai, the veteran Zimbabwean opposition leader who fought Robert Mugabe's regime for many years, has died after a long battle with cancer. Shinge Nyoka takes a look back at his life.
As a rookie challenging one of Africa's ruthless and shrewdest leaders, the odds were always against Morgan Tsvangirai. What he lacked in formal education and liberation war history made up for in boldness, and his popularity soared. As leader of the trade unions, he led the largest anti-government protests since independence, cutting the union's traditional ties with government. Disillusioned with the de facto one-party state and a biting economy, Zimbabweans were ready for an alternative. The MDC was born. In contrast to Mr. Mugabe's exclusionary politics, Mr. Tsvangirai welcomed everybody.
President Tsvangirai managed to bring together the students, the workers, commercial farmers, traditional leaders, war veterans, business people.
Stunned by his popularity, ZANU-PF's response was visceral. With endless arrests, beatings, an assassination attempt and treason charges. President Mugabe suffered his first ever defeat at the polls to Mr. Tsvangirai, who later pulled out of the runoff because of vote rigging and violence.
If it had not been of the cheat, which was then advanced to Morgan, and he accepted it, unfortunately, he would have been president at that time.
I, Morgan Richard Tsvangirai.
Many were therefore disappointed when he agreed to serve under Mr. Mugabe in a power-sharing agreement. In the following elections, he lost heavily. He blamed rigging. His critics said he'd lost credibility, abandoned his working-class roots for the lavish lifestyle common among ZANU-PF. Ultimately, it wasn't Robert Mugabe or the numerous party splits that ended his career, but colon cancer. He failed to unseat Mr. Mugabe, but many here will remember Morgan Tsvangirai as the working-class hero whose fight for democracy triggered the end of the Mugabe era.
And it was Shinge Nyoka reporting. You're watching Newsday on the BBC, live from Singapore and London. Still to come on the program, a staggering number globally. 14 million girls marry as children each year. We'll discuss how the problem can be solved. Welcome back, everyone. You're watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore.
And I'm Sharon Jutlail in London. Thanks for staying with us. Our top stories. At least 17 people have been killed and 20 others injured after a shooter opened fire in a Florida high school. The shooter is now in custody and has been identified as a former student.
South Africa's embattled President Jacob Zuma says he will resign effective immediately. This follows days of defying orders from the country's ruling ANC party to leave office.
Now, Oxfam's director in Asia has told the BBC she's aware of past cases of misconduct involving some of the charity's workers in the Philippines, Bangladesh and Nepal. Senior Oxfam officials have met the UK Charity Commission, which is investigating the organisation's handling of abuse claims against former staff in Haiti in 2011. Our correspondent Angus Crawford has the latest.
A scandal made in the poverty of Haiti's shantytowns, where a small number of aid workers became exploiters. It continues to send shockwaves through the entire sector. And today, new revelations from Oxfam about other underreported cases involving its workers.
There were cases in the Philippines. There were also cases in Bangladesh. There were whistleblowers coming forward in Bangladesh, as far as I know. There was also a case, I think, in Nepal.
Abusers exploit the chaos and confusion of natural disasters, like here in 2013 during Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. And Lan Mercado says even if they are caught and disciplined, charities aren't warning each other about unsuitable staff.
Not yet, but that's a practice that we need to start because, you know, the funny thing about cases like this is we always see them as reputational risks, no? But the way to manage reputational risk is not to keep silent.
But in disaster zones, speed is key. Charities scale up their efforts within hours, employing thousands of new staff, operating in what can be a lawless vacuum. When the first crisis passes, sometimes within days or weeks, many move on to a new emergency and possibly a new employer. So a problem for the whole sector, but one the International Development Secretary wants tackling now.
Unless you create a culture that prioritises the safety of vulnerable people and ensures victims and whistleblowers can come forward without fear, we will not work with you. And unless you report every serious incident and allegation, no matter how damaging to your reputation, we cannot be your partners.
She's looking at the possibility of setting up a worldwide register of aid workers. And tomorrow meets officers from the National Crime Agency, which says it's closely monitoring events. This British charity today dismissed a member of staff accused of sexual misconduct while at Oxfam in Haiti in 2011, something he failed to tell them when he applied for the job. And tonight, Oxfam has revealed that last year it sacked its country director in Haiti for mismanagement and inappropriate behaviour. Angus Crawford, BBC News.
And also making news today, US Vice President Mike Pence says that the Trump administration is open to holding talks with North Korea, but stressed that this would not equate to negotiations. Mr. Pence spoke after attending the Winter Olympics in South Korea last week, at which he avoided contact with a North Korean delegation that held talks with the South Korean leadership.
It's accurate to say that we want to make sure North Korea understands us. And if there's an opportunity for talks that can communicate the fixed policy of the United States of America to them, the President's made it clear. He always believes in talking. But talking is not negotiation. Talking is understanding one another. There is no daylight between the United States of America and South Korea and Japan on our commitment to continue to intensify our maximum pressure campaign on North Korea until they abandon their nuclear weapons program.
Now, Donald Trump's longtime personal lawyer has admitted privately paying a porn star more than $100,000 a month before the U.S. elections in 2016. The manager for the porn star, Stormy Daniels, says her client is no longer bound by a non-disclosure contract after the admission and now free to tell her story.
Globally, more than 14 million girls marry each year. Today, over 700 million women alive were child brides. Despite laws against child and early forced marriages in many countries, the practice remains widespread. In Vietnam, some cases have resulted in the kidnapping of children were forced into marriage. Earlier, I spoke to Russia Sikolovich, the regional head of child protection of the children rights advocacy group Plan International, who is working to end child marriages.
It's a serious issue and it's a global phenomenon that robs children, and particularly girls, of their childhood and any opportunities to thrive and develop to their full potential.
How is this happening, Russia?
It's a very complex phenomenon. It's not new, and it's happening for a variety of reasons, including gender inequalities that actually reduce girls to their traditional roles, reproductive roles and expectations. It's also happening because of economic scarcities, economic pressure on families to marry off girls because of lack of other options. It's happening also because of lack of proper laws or proper law implementation. It's a variety of reasons.
It is indeed a very complex problem, but what must be done by governments here in Asia to combat this issue?
Actually, a lot has been done, and this complex phenomenon also requires a complex series of interventions. Governments are aligning their laws, but laws are just in legal frameworks. But laws, as we know, are just starting points to actually combat any negative trends. First of all, girls themselves, communities and families need to be aware, and we need to challenge these norms that are underlined by gender inequalities and gender stereotypes. Of course, economic safety measures targeting these vulnerable families should also be prioritized. But more than anything, more opportunities for girls, girls' empowerment.
In which particular Asian countries, Russia, is this problem most common?
Sadly, our region, Asian and Pacific, tops off some of the global lists of child early and forced marriage prevalence. And it really varies from Bangladesh, where there is the highest prevalence of girls that are married off early, to Vietnam, where the numbers are lowest. But actually, numbers can be tricky as well, because it's also about severity of these incidents.
And most of these girls cross over to mainland China. How does this happen?
Actually, it happens in different parts of the region, and it happens from a variety of reasons, as I mentioned. It happens because borders are not properly controlled or borders are porous. It happens because girls and families trust people who actually earn their trust and promise them opportunities and prospects of better life. And it also happens in those remote areas, even though it happens in urban places as well, because it's easier to smuggle, to kidnap and smuggle girls across the borders.
And that was Russia Sekulichov from Plan International. And that's it for this edition of Newsday. Gong Xi Fa Chai. Happy Chinese Year, everyone. I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore.
Well, before we go, though, let's remind you of our top story. And officials in Florida in the United States say 17 people have been killed and at least 20 injured. And that's after a man opened fire at a high school. Police say they've arrested the suspect, believed to be a former student at the school. And it's the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland. Of course, we'll be continuing to follow that developing story throughout the program. So stay with us on BBC World News.